Hey guys, this is Dr. Cummings from Point Loma Nazarene. In this series of 5 videos, we're going to talk about cellular communication. That has nothing to do with your iPhone. Remember, this is a class in cell biology, biochemistry, and so we're interested in how cells communicate with one another. Typically, that is found in a multicellular organism like a human being. But it does turn out that some other cells that are individual organisms can communicate with one another, and they use some similar principles. So what I want to do in this first video is just kind of give the big picture of what cell communication is all about, and then from there we'll start getting into the nitty-gritty. So the second video will be on 5 models, 5 different ways, common ways that cell-to-cell communication takes place. And then each of the 3 major stages of cellular communication, receptor activation, signal transduction, and cellular response, I'll break out into a separate video. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So what exactly is cell communication? What you've got here in this image is 2 cells at the very end of mitosis. Mitosis is a really important process, very, very carefully regulated, and therefore there's a lot of communication, both internal, you could think of it as self-talk, and external, where the cell is receiving signals from the outside and it's also receiving signals from itself to determine whether or not it's time to start dividing, and then to regulate the steps and stages of mitosis. Anything messes up that communication, and you can potentially have growth that's out of control, unregulated growth, which typically leads to cancer. So a definition then of cell communication might be the process through which cells detect and respond to signals. They detect and they respond to signals. Now the definition here says it's in their extracellular environment, but understand there are some examples where the signal actually originates in the same cell. Sometimes that signal leaves the cell, comes back in again. Other times the signal is entirely self-contained. So this is what we're talking about when we say cell or cellular communication. There are a few major steps here, kind of big picture overview, right? So on the left we've got an image of a cell and it's got a receptor. And a receptor has a very specific binding site that will bind only to a very specific signal molecule. Now for any given cell, it's not just going to have that one copy of the receptor, and it's not just going to have one receptor for one signal. So a typical cell might have receptors for several different signals that it needs to keep track of or needs to be able to respond to. And then it probably has hundreds or thousands of exact copies of each receptor on its surface. These are transmembrane proteins that have an extracellular domain that's going to interact with the signal, and an intracellular domain that's going to interact with some sort of a signal relay system, and we'll look at those shortly. So if we've got a signal molecule, that's what's in yellow in the top left, and we've got a cell with a receptor, the first step is to create what's called a signal receptor complex, where the signal and the receptor bind together tightly. They have a very positive fit. And when we talk about a signal molecule and its receptor fitting together, it's similar conceptually to how an enzyme and its substrate fit together. It's a very specific fit, and it's based on both the shape of the signal and receptor as well as the chemistry and how compatible the very localized chemistries of the two are, so that they have to fit just right and have the appropriate, for example, charge distribution in the right orientation. Once we get that signal receptor complex, then we're going to somehow relay that signal to some kind of proteins inside the cell that can carry out an appropriate response, where the cell will actually change in its behavior. And we'll talk about what some of those cell responses, some of the more common cell responses are. And those intracellular signaling pathways are sometimes referred to as a signal cascade, because often what happens is the receptor itself interacts with and activates some soluble molecule in the cytoplasm, usually a protein, that then interacts with another protein and activates that one, which then interacts with another protein and activates that one. The more steps there are, the more opportunities there are for the cell to regulate this whole process. In some cases, there's just a single intermediate. In other cases, there's multiple. And in some cases, there's what we call a second messenger, and we'll talk about that special situation in a later video. Now, the simplest form of cell communication is simply a cell observing, if you will, its environment and responding to its environment. So in the case of what we call cellular response or cellular adaptation, there's not another cell sending the signal. This is simply environmental conditions, oxygen concentration, in this case glucose availability. It could be pH, it could be the availability of amino acids or nucleotides, all kinds of possibilities. So most cells have receptors on their surface that let them assess accurately the conditions around them, the biochemical and physicochemical conditions around them, and then respond to them. And we call this a cellular adaptation, or sometimes simply the cellular response. So here's an example with a yeast cell, where the whole organism is just one cell, so there's not some other cell in the organism sending a signal to it. What we've got here in purple represents the cell membrane, the cytoplasmic membrane. The little dog bone looking structures, we're told, are glucose receptors. And on the outside, this kind of golden color here is the cell wall made of chitin. So your first question should be, well, what's the signal going to be? Is it glucose? Is it the glucose receptor? Is it the yeast? Is it some other molecule? Hopefully, based on the way I described how cellular adaptation works, you recognize that the signal for the glucose receptor will be glucose molecules themselves, these little purple guys in the image. And then the question is, well, what's a likely cellular response? If a yeast cell is swimming around out there in the world and its glucose receptors detect glucose, what should it do? What would be an appropriate response? Well, I'll show you what happens in this particular situation is the glucose receptor sends a signal, we won't get into the signal transduction just yet, sends a signal to the cell's interior. In this case, it's to the nucleus of the cell where the DNA is being housed, and it initiates expression of two types of genes. Glucose transporters, like this one right here, that weren't there to begin with. Why make transporters if there's no glucose around? And then the metabolic enzymes. For example, the enzymes necessary for glycolysis. Why bother making those enzymes if there's no glucose around? It's a waste of energy. And so by responding to the environment, by having receptors that detect the signal, and the signal being the actual molecule of interest, in this case glucose, it allows the cell to not waste resources on things like glucose transporters and glycolysis enzymes unless glucose is available. This would be the simplest form of cellular communication, and all cells do this at various levels and in various ways. What we'll do, though, from here on out, starting with the next video, is really focus on cell-to-cell communication in multicellular organisms. So I hope you'll join me on that next video.